The enemy sniper had been watching for 3 hours, and the moment Corporal Sullivan lifted his head an inch too high, the man on the ridge squeezed the trigger and put a bullet through the only gap in the American's armor. Sullivan's spun hit the rocks, and his rifle went flying into the dark. And down below, a 24-year-old woman who had never fired a shot in combat until that night stared at that abandoned rifle and understood that if nobody picked it up in the next 10 seconds, every man around her was going to die. Before we go on, I want to ask you something small. If a story like this means anything to you, take a second to subscribe to the channel and follow all the way to the end, because these stories only travel when people like you carry them. And do me a favor, leave a comment and tell me the city you're watching from. I love seeing exactly how far these stories reach. Now let me take you back. 72 hours before Inslee Grant became a sniper, her biggest worry in the world was a number that didn't add up. She sat in the cool dark of the supply depot at Forward Operating Base. Griffin hunched over a battered laptop that took 30 full seconds to load every single page, and she stared at a discrepancy in the ammunition inventory that shouldn't have been there. 7,200 rounds of 5.56. She had counted them twice. The number on the screen said something different from the number in the room, and to most people that would have meant nothing. To an Inslee, it meant everything. "Come on," she muttered to the screen. "You had it right yesterday." She reloaded the page, waited, counted her own breathing while the little wheel spun. When the numbers finally came up, she leaned in close and her lips moved as she matched each lot against each line, and slowly her shoulders came down from around her ears. A miscount. Somebody had logged a case twice. She fixed it, saved it, and sat back. That was who she was. Order. Systems. Predictability. A world where every bullet had a home, and every home had a bullet, and if something was wrong, you found it, and you made it right, and then you could breathe again. She was 24 years old, and she was a long way from Butte, Montana. Her father had spent his life in the copper mines until the day a cave-in crushed 3 vertebrae in his lower back and left him a man who could no longer stand without his face going gray. Her mother taught elementary school and stretched $1 until it screamed for mercy. When Ann Inslee graduated high school, nobody in that house said the word college out loud because the family needed money coming in, not more debt going out. The Army came to towns like Butte because towns like Butte had nothing else to offer their children but the same gray mountains they'd been staring at their whole lives. She signed the papers 2 weeks after her 18th birthday. Basic training nearly broke her. There was a drill sergeant whose neck veins bulged when he screamed, and there were nights she lay in her bunk and thought about quitting with a longing that scared her. 3 recruits in her platoon walked away in the first week. Ann Inslee wanted to walk away every single day. But quitting meant going home with nothing. Quitting meant her father had ruined his back for nothing. Quitting meant she really was as small as that gray Montana town had always told her she was. So she didn't quit, not out of courage. She would have told you that plainly. She stayed because the alternative was unbearable, and there is a kind of stubbornness that looks like bravery from the outside, but feels like desperation from the inside, and that was the engine that drove her. They put her in logistics, supply chain, counting. It wasn't glamorous, and nobody was going to write a song about the woman who verified serial numbers, but it fit the shape of her mind like a key fits a lock. She never forgot an order. She never miscounted twice. Her superiors noticed her the way you notice a machine that never breaks, and eventually they sent her here to Griffin, to the middle of nowhere, where the insurgents owned the hills, and every convoy that rolled out the gate was a coin flip on a life. She closed the laptop and wiped the sweat off her forehead, even though she was sitting in the shade. Lunch, the mess hall, the same 3 faces she ate with every day. There was Briggs, the mechanic out of Texas who could rebuild a Humvee engine blindfolded and had a loud opinion about everything from football to foreign policy. There was Keller, the communications specialist who ran the encrypted radios and told the worst jokes on the base with the best comedic timing she'd ever heard. And there was Marcus Vaughn. Marcus was the combat medic. He had saved more lives than he could count, and he never talked about a single one of them. She grabbed a tray of something that might have been chicken and found Marcus sitting alone in a corner, and she sat down across from him without asking, because that's how it worked out there. You didn't wait for an invitation. Invitations were for people with time. He looked up at her, and his eyes had that hollowed-out look. Dark circles, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't touch. "Inventory day," he said, managing half a smile. "Every day is inventory day. She poked her fork at the chicken and it bounced back at her. You look like hell, Marcus. He didn't argue. He stared down into his coffee like there was something at the bottom of it. Medevac came in at 0300, he said quietly. IED. Kid was 19. She didn't say anything. She never knew what to say when he talked like this. Couldn't save his legs, Marcus said. The words just sat there on the table between them. Ann Inslee looked at her tray and felt small and useless. Her whole war took place in a climate-controlled room with clean spreadsheets. His took place in blood and screaming and choices no human being should have to make before breakfast. They ate in silence for a while. Then Marcus set down his fork with a deliberateness that made her look up, and there was something new in his face. You should learn more than logistics, he said. She blinked. What? There are training opportunities on this base. Combat first aid, weapons handling, land navigation. He leaned forward across the table. Most support personnel never touch any of it. They figure it's not their job. But everybody should know how to defend themselves. Everybody should know how to keep another person alive when everything's coming apart. Marcus, I went through basic. I know how to shoot. He didn't say it cruel. He said it like a doctor asking a question he already knew the answer to. When was the last time you actually fired a weapon? She opened her mouth and then she stopped because she had to think about it, and the fact that she had to think about it was the answer. Basic training, she said finally, 18 months ago. That's what I thought. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled scrap of paper and slid it across the table to her. Master Sergeant Morris runs a program, Tuesday and Thursday evenings. It's optional. Nobody's making you. He stood, picked up his tray, and looked down at her one more time. Show up if you want to be more than a name on a casualty list, Grant. And then he walked away before she could say a single word back. She looked at the paper in her hand. Crude handwriting. Times and a location on the far side of the base. And down at the bottom, one line. Every soldier holds the line when the moment demands it. She folded it and put it in her pocket, and she told herself she probably wouldn't go. She had inventory to run, reports to file. Her job mattered enough on its own. She didn't need to go stand on a range and pretend she was somebody she wasn't. But that evening, when the last spreadsheet was closed and the depot was locked, she found her feet carrying her across the base toward the coordinates on that paper, and she couldn't have told you exactly why. The shooting range sat at the far edge of Griffin, ringed by blast barriers watched over by a guard tower. And even now, hours past noon, the heat came off the ground like an open oven. A small cluster of soldiers stood near a weapons rack, and most of them were younger than her. Support people by the look of them. Comms techs, mechanics, clerks. People who normally never held anything more dangerous than a clipboard. And facing them stood an old man. He had to be pushing 70, which in the Army made him practically a fossil. His face was creased and weathered like something left out in the sun for decades. Scars ran down both forearms. He walked with a limp, favoring his left leg. But his eyes were sharp, and when they landed on Ann Inslee, she felt herself being measured, weighed, and filed away in about 3 seconds flat. You're new, he said. His voice was gravel, dragged over gravel. An Inslee Grant, logistics specialist. Morse, Master Sergeant, retired. He didn't offer a hand. You know how to shoot? I qualified in basic training. That means nothing. He turned to the rack and pulled out an M4 carbine and held it out to her. This is an M4. 5.56, effective range 300 meters. You'll start here. She took it. It felt heavier than she remembered, and the metal was hot from the sun, and for the next 20 minutes he walked her through fundamentals. She thought she already knew and discovered she'd half forgotten. How to seat the magazine, how to find the sight picture, how to breathe before the trigger instead of during it. He gave her no encouragement and no criticism. He handed her information the way you'd hand a wrench to a mechanic with the simple expectation that she'd use it. Then he pointed downrange at paper targets 100 yards out. Show me what basic gave you. Her hands were sweating inside her gloves. She pressed the stock into her shoulder, found the front sight, and tried to pull 18 months of dust off the machinery in her head. Breathe slow. Squeeze, don't pull. Follow through. She fired 5 rounds one after another, and the rifle kicked into her shoulder each time, and gunpowder filled her nose, and when she lowered it, Morse walked down range without a word. He looked at the target for a long moment. Then he turned around and came back and took the rifle out of her hands. Look at your grouping, he said. She squinted. Her 5 shots had punched through the paper in a cluster about the size of her fist, every one of them within a few inches of center. Most beginners scatter rounds all over the place, Morse said quietly. Their hands shake. They flinch. They pull the trigger instead of squeezing it. He looked at her with those sharp old eyes. You did none of those things. I just tried to remember what you said. Your grouping is tight. Your shots are controlled. He paused and something shifted behind his face. Not approval, something more careful than that. You have natural talent. Most people don't. That means you should develop it. She almost laughed. She almost said something to make it smaller because that was what she did with anything good that came her way. But he'd already turned back to the rack, and something about that stopped her. Over the weeks that followed, she showed up every Tuesday and every Thursday, and she started to notice something she hadn't expected. She looked forward to it. Her logistics work mattered. She knew that. But it was the same spreadsheets and the same counts and the same reports in the same format, and there was no thrill in a column that balanced. The range was different. On the range, there was an answer every single time. Either the bullet went where she meant it to, or it didn't. No paperwork, no ambiguity, just physics and skill, and the quiet inside her own head when everything else lined up. Morse taught with an intensity that never raised its voice. He explained the science of it, how wind bends a bullet's path, how temperature changes the way powder burns, how breathing at the wrong instant can throw your point of impact by inches at a distance where inches are the difference between a life and a miss. By the 3rd week, he had her on different systems. The M24 OB machine gun, the M249, each one with its own recoil, its own rhythm, its own personality. Then in the 6th week, he brought out something different. The rifle sat on the bench like a piece of precision machinery, which is exactly what it was. Longer than the M4, heavier, a powerful scope mounted along the top. This was not a weapon for spraying rounds at things close by. This was a scalpel meant for surgery at distances most people couldn't imagine. Morse handled it like something holy. 110, he said, 7.62 NATO, effective range 800 meters, semi-automatic so you can put rounds down range faster than a bolt gun. He looked at her, but it demands perfect trigger discipline. Any flinch you have gets magnified through that scope. There's nowhere to hide. He set targets out at 300 yards, tiny pale dots in the shimmering heat. She settled in behind the rifle and pressed her eye to the scope, and the world snapped into a brutal, beautiful clarity. She could see the individual staple holes in the paper. 300 yards folded down into 50. Breathe slow, Morse said beside her, calm as still water. Let half the breath out. Hold. Squeeze. The rifle bucked harder than the M4, and the boom of it was louder and deeper, and through the scope she watched the round punch through the paper just left of center. Wind, Morse said. You didn't account for the crosswind. Try again. She adjusted. She breathed. She squeezed. The second shot went dead center. By the end of that session, she had put 9 out of 10 rounds inside a 6-inch circle at 300 yards, and her shoulder ached, and her eyes were dry from the scope, but somewhere inside her chest, something had gone quiet and settled in a way it almost never did. Morse said nothing while they cleaned the weapons. He waited until they were nearly done, and then he spoke without looking at her. You could do this professionally, he said. Sniper school, precision marksman courses. He paused. You've got the temperament for it. Patience. No ego. The ability to be still and wait. She laughed uncomfortable and looked away. I'm happy in logistics. I don't need to be a hero. It's not about being a hero. His voice came down hard and flat. It's about using what you were given. Not everyone can do what you just did. Most people can't. He turned and looked straight at her. I've been teaching marksmanship for 25 years, trained hundreds of soldiers. You are in the top 5% of natural shooters I have ever put behind a rifle. She mumbled something about being lucky and helped him finish cleaning in silence because she didn't have the first idea what to do with a sentence like that. But it stayed with her. It stayed with her during inventory the next morning. It stayed with her at night in her bunk with the desert wind howling outside the wall. Could she really do more than count bullets? The question felt dangerous, like a door she might not be able to close once she opened it. September rolled toward October. The sessions went on and her skill kept climbing, and Morse started teaching her things that sounded like witchcraft. How to calculate bullet drop at extreme range. How to read the mirage shimmering through the scope to guess the wind. How the spin of the earth itself could nudge a bullet off course past 1,000 yards. And then one evening after a session where every shot went where she sent it, Morse did something he'd never done. He invited her to sit on the tailgate of his truck. He pulled 2 bottles of water out of a cooler and handed her one, and they sat there in the fading light with the war just beyond the barriers, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. "I had a daughter," Morse said suddenly. She turned and looked at him. He never talked about himself. Not once. "She'd be about your age now," he said at 24, 25. He took a long drink. "Haven't spoken to her in 6 years. Sergeant, you don't have to. She said I chose the Army over family." His voice stayed flat, but the pain lived under every word. "Said I was never there when it counted. She's probably right. I gave the military 25 years. Grenada in 83, Panama in 89, Desert Storm in 91. Came home every time with more scars and more stories, and every time I'd missed another birthday. Another graduation. Every single moment that actually mattered to her, I was somewhere else doing this." He turned to look at her and his eyes were wet, and it stopped the breath in her throat because she had never once imagined this man could cry. "My wife died of cancer in 2008, he said. "My daughter didn't call to tell me until 3 days after the funeral. That's when I knew. That's when I finally understood I'd failed at the only things that were ever supposed to matter." Ann Inslee didn't know what to do. She'd never seen this. The broken parts underneath the hard shell. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked so quietly the wind almost took it. "Because you remind me of her," Morse said, looking back out at the fading light. "Same stubbornness, same quiet strength. Teaching you feels like a second chance. Like maybe I can do right by somebody even if I never got the chance to do right by her." The weight of that settled down between them on the tailgate, and all at once she understood why this retired old man drove out to a range twice a week for people who could do nothing for him. She wasn't just a student to him. She was a stand-in for a daughter he'd lost and would probably never get back. "I'm sorry," she said, because nothing else was big enough. "Don't be sorry," he said. "Just don't waste what you've got." He stood stiff, his bad leg making him wince. Talent is rare. Purpose is rarer. If you ever find them both together in one place, you hold on with both hands and you don't let go. Mid-October brought Operation Valkyrie. The briefing was in a secured room with maps covering every wall, and Ann Inslee sat in the back with the other support personnel trying to make sense of tactical overlays and grid coordinates that meant nothing to her. At the front stood Lieutenant Boone Garrett, compact mid-30s, a thick Alabama accent, and the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from a man who has led other men through gunfire and brought them home. A SEAL. The kind of soldier who made the impossible look like an afternoon chore. He laid it out with clinical calm. Intelligence had a Taliban weapons cache 18 miles north of the base. High-value target confirmed on site. A 14-man SEAL team would go in by helicopter under cover of darkness, cross the last stretch on foot, clear the compound, and be gone before the sun came up. But they needed support. Somebody to manage ammunition resupply. Somebody to haul extra medical gear. Somebody who could stay close to the fighting and not fall apart. Garrett's eyes swept the room. "I need a volunteer from logistics. Somebody reliable. Somebody who won't freeze up if things get complicated." And Ann Inslee's hand went up before she had consciously decided to raise it. She looked at her own arm in the air like it belonged to somebody else. "Grant," Garrett said and nodded once. "You're on the manifest. Report to the armory at 2200 tomorrow for gear." And that was it. No discussion. No second chance to take it back. She had volunteered and now she was in. Outside the building, Morse was waiting for her. He must have known she'd be there. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You don't have to do this," he finally said. "Logistics specialists don't go outside the wire. That's not your job." "I know." "Then why?" She thought about it, and she was surprised to find how calm she felt. "Because they need somebody reliable," she said. "And because you've spent weeks telling me I'm capable of more than I think I am. Maybe it's time I found out if you're right." Morse studied her face for a long time. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather notebook, its cover worn smooth from years of handling, and he pressed it into her hands. Started writing this in '83, he said. Every lesson I learned the hard way. Every mistake that almost got me killed. Every piece of wisdom I decided was worth passing on. She opened it, page after page of sketches and calculations and cramped handwriting, wind drift tables, range estimation, notes on breath control and trigger discipline, a lifetime of hard-earned knowledge crammed into leather and paper. I can't take this, she said. Sergeant, this is yours. It's yours now. His voice left no room to argue. Trust what I taught you. You're ready for more than carrying boxes, Grant. You've always been ready. You just needed the right circumstances to make you see it. He gripped her shoulder once hard, and then he walked away, and he did not look back. The night before the mission, she lay in her bunk staring up at the fan turning slow circles in the hot air, and she thought about home. Her father in the living room in front of the television because standing hurt too much to do anything else. Her mother grading papers at the kitchen table with her reading glasses sliding down her nose. Her younger brother working 2 jobs to scrape together community college tuition. They had no idea what she was about to do. They thought she counted supplies in a safe warehouse. They thought she was untouchable. Maybe she was. The briefing made it sound almost simple. Stay 50 yards back, hand out ammunition when it's needed. Let the SEALs do the dangerous part. Let the professionals handle the killing. But there had been something in Morse's eyes when he handed her that notebook. Something that told her he knew better than the briefing did. Something that told her plans rarely survive the first contact with the real world. She pulled the notebook out from under her pillow and flipped through it by the dim light of a battery lantern, and on the inside of the back cover she found an inscription she hadn't seen before written in his careful hand. Ann Inslee, you'll hit a wall. Everyone does. When you want to quit, remember the only failure is stopping before you're finished. Everything else is just a temporary setback. You've got this. You've always had this. Callahan Morse. And below it, a date, September 14th, the day before she'd raised her hand to volunteer. He had known. Somehow before she ever knew it herself, he had known she'd end up here. The helicopter ride toward the objective felt like a slow descent into hell. Ann Inslee sat in the Black Hawk surrounded by 14 SEALs who checked their weapons with the mechanical calm of men who had done this 100 times. Nobody spoke. There was only the chop of the rotor blades and the occasional crackle of the pilots talking to each other over the radio. It was September the 12th, 0230, and the desert stretched black and empty beneath them, visible only as darker shapes against a darker sky, with stars overhead, burning cold and clear. She checked her gear for the 100th time. 320 rounds of 7.62 split into 16 magazines across her vest, a trauma kit strapped to her thigh, 6 liters of water, her M4 loaded safety on barrel down, everything in its place, everything accounted for. It was the only prayer she knew how to say. Across from her sat a corporal named Sullivan. The others called him Reaper, though she didn't know why. He was 28, and he was from Montana, same as her, with a kind of icy calm that never seemed to crack no matter what the world threw at him. His weapon was an M11, the same rifle Morse had been putting in her hands twice a week for a month and a half. Sullivan caught her looking, and he nodded once. No words. Just an acknowledgement between 2 people from the same cold mountains who had somehow both ended up in this hot desert, getting ready to do violence in the dark. The helicopter banked and her stomach lurched, and she gripped the harness and focused on breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way Morse had taught her. Lieutenant Garrett's voice came over everyone's headset, calm and even. 5 minutes to insertion, final checks. The SEALs moved in perfect synchronization. Magazines, night vision, gear cinched down so nothing rattled. These men had done this so many times it was routine to them. For Ann Inslee, it was anything but. 2 minutes out, the lieutenant said, and then the world came apart. The pilot's voice cracked with sudden urgency, all the calm gone out of it in an instant. RPG, brake right. The helicopter jerked sideways so violently she was thrown against her harness. Through the open door, she saw streaks of light racing up out of the black ground below. Tracer rounds, dozens of them, green fingers reaching up for the aircraft with pure murder in them. This was not supposed to happen. The intelligence had said the ground would be clear until they reached the compound. Somebody had been wrong. Somebody had been catastrophically, fatally wrong. Garrett was shouting orders, but the words were lost in the chaos. Then a sound like a hammer the size of a truck, striking metal, and the whole aircraft shuddered, and warning lights flared red across the cabin, and the smell of burning hydraulic fluid filled her nose. The Black Hawk spun. The horizon tilted at an angle that made no sense. Her head slammed against the bulkhead despite the harness, and stars burst across her vision, and a high, thin ringing swallowed every other sound. The ground came up to meet them. The pilot fought it every inch of the way, pulling every trick he had left to keep them in the air, and at the last possible second, he leveled the nose. But the landing was more brutal than anything she'd ever imagined. Impact. Metal screaming, the aircraft bounced once, twice, and slid sideways across rock and sand, and the sound of it was the sound of the end of the world. Rotor blades disintegrating, supports bending, a wall of dust swallowing everything. Then stillness, a terrible ringing stillness. Her hands moved on their own. Unbuckle the harness, grab the rifle, check for injuries. Her head throbbed and blood trickled from somewhere on her scalp. But she could move and she could think, and around her, the SEALs were already pouring out of the wreck. Garrett was dragging the unconscious pilot out of his seat. The co-pilot was bleeding from the head but conscious enough to stumble. And then bullets began snapping through the air. That ugly close crack of rounds passing near your skull, and she understood with total clarity that the enemy had seen the crash and they were coming. She stumbled out onto legs that didn't feel like hers. Muzzle flashes sparked in the dark about 180 yards to the west, men shouting in a language she didn't understand. And the SEALs, God bless them, were already establishing a defensive perimeter with a speed that stunned her. Garrett everywhere at once, positioning men directing fire. One SEAL had the M24OB up and running, pouring suppressive fire into the dark. And Sullivan scrambled up onto a rocky outcropping 30 feet away and set up his M11. With quick, efficient hands, and within seconds the rifle spoke. A deep boom that rolled across the desert. A pause. Another boom, and out in the dark, insurgents began to drop at distances she could barely see. She dropped to the sand beside a SEAL and tore open her supply pack because this was her job. Distribute ammunition. Keep the shooters fed. She crawled from position to position, pressing fresh magazines into gloved hands, collecting the empties. Rounds kicked up sand around her. One passed so close she felt the air move against her cheek. But she kept crawling because this was what she'd trained for. This was why her hand had gone up. Do the job. Don't think. Just do the job. Sullivan's rifle kept working. Every 8 or 10 seconds, another boom. Another threat gone. He was their lifeline. As long as that rifle kept talking, it held the enemy back at a distance they couldn't fight from. And then at 0312, everything changed. Sullivan shifted position to get a cleaner angle on a machine gun nest that was finding their range, and for just one instant, just one single moment, he exposed himself. The crack of the incoming round was different from all the others, sharper, more focused. A patient man on the far ridge had been waiting for exactly this, and the bullet found the gap between Sullivan's shoulder and his armor plate. The impact spun him around and threw him against the rocks, and his rifle clattered away across the stone, and dark blood began spreading across his uniform. Marcus was already moving before Sullivan hit the ground. The medic crossed 30 feet in seconds, kit in his hands, and went straight to work. Pressure on the wound, packing it with clotting gauze, starting an IV line one-handed while he held the wound with the other. Sullivan was conscious but going into shock, and she could hear him from where she crouched. Can't shoot. Rifle? Garrett's voice cut through the radio, urgent and controlled. We need that gun position back. Sullivan's down. Who can shoot? Nobody answered. The other SEALs were fully committed in their own sectors. Marcus had both hands full, keeping Sullivan alive. The pilots were wounded, and out in the dark the enemy felt the loss of that devastating precision fire, and they grew bolder by the second, moving closer, their shots getting more accurate, tightening the noose. And Ninsley Grant knelt in the sand and stared at the M11, lying abandoned on the rocks 30 feet away, starlight glinting off the scope. That rifle had been holding the entire battlefield in one man's hands. Every time it spoke, an enemy died or took cover or lost his nerve. Now it sat silent, and without it, every man around her was going to be overrun and killed inside of minutes. You're ready for more than you know. Morse's voice right there in her head, plain as if he were kneeling beside her. Her body moved before her mind finished the argument. She dropped the supply pack. Her legs carried her scrambling up the rocks toward Sullivan's position. Somewhere behind her, Garrett was shouting something, but the words didn't land. There was only the rifle. There was only the need. There was only the empty space where that boom used to be, and every second it stayed empty, another man came closer to dying. Her hands closed around the M. 110, heavy, familiar. The exact weight of 100 training sessions of Morse's calm voice of 9 out of 10 inside a 6-inch circle. But this was not the range at Griffin. This was not paper. This was real, and it was life and death, and it was hers now. She threw herself down into the exact spot where Sullivan had been, the high rocks giving her a clean view of the approaches, and she pressed her eye to the scope, and the world leapt into terrible clarity. She could see everything. Faces 350 yards out. Bearded men with wrapped keffiyehs and AK-47s. Young men and old men, some scared, some calm. Every one of them trying to kill her, and everyone she was fighting beside. Her hands were shaking. The crosshairs wandered wildly across her view, and this was nothing like paper because these were people, real human beings, with families and histories and futures. And one of them was setting up a PKM machine gun behind a large rock, and she knew with cold certainty that if that gun opened up, it would cut through the sealed positions like a chainsaw through paper. She put the crosshairs on his chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she reached back for everything Morse had ever given her. Breathe, trigger control, follow through. Don't think about the man. Think about the mechanics, muscle memory and practice. Nothing more than that. She took a breath and let half of it out and held the rest. Her finger took up the slack. Steady, steady. The rifle bucked hard against her shoulder, and the boom rolled across the desert and through the scope. She watched the man behind the machine gun fall, and the PKM went silent before it ever fired a single round. She had just killed a human being. And she waited for the horror to arrive. The guilt. The moral earthquake that was supposed to come with taking a life. But it didn't come. There was only a strange roaring numbness, and underneath it, the immediate screaming need to find the next threat because people were depending on her, because this was the moment, because she was the only thing holding the line now. Her hands chambered a fresh round. The spent brass clinked off the rocks. She scanned, and a fighter was running between positions exposed for one heartbeat, and she led him slightly to account for the movement, the way Morse had drilled into her, and she fired, and he went down hard. The rifle became an extension of her body. Load, aim, breathe, fire. Each shot its own separate task demanding total concentration, and she stopped thinking about the war and the men and the meaning of any of it. There was only the scope and the trigger. Below her, she heard Garrett on the radio, and there was surprise in his voice and something more than surprise. Grant's on the gun. Somebody put Grant on the gun. She didn't correct him. It didn't matter who he thought was up there. All that mattered was the next shot and the next and the next. The enemy took casualties from the elevated position and realized the sniper was back, and they grew cautious again, hugging cover, limiting their exposure, and that was exactly what the SEALs needed. Breathing room, a chance to reorganize. She shifted her focus, higher value targets now, a commander directing his fighters from behind a disabled truck, maybe 520 yards out when nearly nothing. She adjusted her aim point up to account for the drop the way she'd done 1,000 times on paper, and she held her breath and she fired. The commander dropped and the men around him scattered in confusion, and without him, their attack lost its shape and began to come apart. The minutes blurred together, and she lost count of her shots. The rifle grew hot in her hands. Sweat ran into her eyes and stung and made it hard to see through the scope. Her shoulder ached from the recoil. But she kept shooting because stopping meant dying, and she had come too far to stop now. A bullet struck the rock inches from her head, and stone fragments sprayed across her face, and she felt sharp stings on her cheek and blood running down her neck into her collar, and she shifted 6 inches and kept firing, because the wound didn't matter. Nothing mattered except holding this position. And then she heard the most beautiful sound she had ever heard in her life. The distant thumping whoop, whoop, whoop of helicopter rotors coming in from the dark. She glanced up and saw 2 Apache gunships streaking across the sky like avenging angels. And everything changed in a single instant. The Apaches opened up with a fury that made her rifle seem like a child's toy. The enemy attack collapsed. Fighters broke and ran, trying to escape the wrath coming down out of the sky. and it was over. Anansley lowered the rifle and her whole body began to tremble as the adrenaline drained out of her all at once and every muscle turned to water. She slumped against the rocks, suddenly aware of the blood drying on her face, of the bruise blooming across her shoulder, of the ringing that filled her ears where the boom of the rifle used to be. She had held the line. The girl who counted bullets had picked up a rifle in the worst moment of her life, and she had held the line, and every man on that rock was still breathing because of it. And down below in the settling dust, she could hear Marcus still working over. Sullivan could hear Garrett calling in the extraction, could hear the ordinary miraculous sounds of men who were going to live. She stared at her own hands, at the rifle across her lap, and she understood, sitting there in the dark with the smell of gunpowder still in her nose, that the woman who had climbed up onto these rocks was not the same woman who was going to climb down. She just didn't know yet how far that change was going to carry her or what it was going to cost. Lieutenant Garrett climbed up to her position while the dust was still settling and his face was covered in grime and sweat, and there was blood on his uniform from wounds she hadn't even seen him take during the fight. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't read. Respect maybe, or plain disbelief. "You're hit," he said. His voice was raw from shouting orders all night. She wiped the blood off her cheek with the back of her hand and looked at the smear of it like it belonged to somebody else. "Still holding together, sir." He nodded slowly, and he didn't say anything for a second, and then he did. "You gave us the room we needed. Sullivan owes you his life." He paused and something in his jaw worked. "We all do." That was all. 4 words. But coming from a SEAL team leader with 15 years of combat behind him, those 4 words weighed more than any medal they could ever pin on her chest, and she felt them land somewhere deep. He turned and started back down the rocks, and then he stopped halfway and looked back up at her one more time. "Sullivan's stable. Marcus got him patched. You saved lives tonight, Grant." He held her eyes. "Don't you ever forget that." And then he was gone back into the work of getting his men home. She sat alone on the rocks with Sullivan's rifle across her lap, and the sky in the east was beginning to shift black, bleeding into deep blue, and then into a thin line of orange along the horizon. And she waited for the guilt to come. She had killed people tonight. At least 8 she could confirm, maybe more. And she sat there, and she braced herself for the horror that was supposed to arrive. But it didn't. There was only exhaustion, a bone-deep numbness. And underneath it, something she did not want to look at directly, something that shamed her even as she felt it. Satisfaction. The plain, cold knowledge that she had performed when it mattered most. That her shots had been clean. That she had done exactly what needed doing. Was that wrong? Was she supposed to feel worse? She turned the question over and over, and she had no answer for it, and the not having an answer scared her more than any of it. The extraction birds came in loud and fast medevac helicopters with red crosses painted on their sides, and a security team fanned out to hold a perimeter while the medics rushed the wounded. Sullivan went first. They had him on a stretcher with IV bags swinging from the poles, Marcus walking alongside and still giving orders despite the wound in his own leg. The SEAL sniper's face was gray from blood loss, but he was awake, and as they carried him past her position, he turned his head and found her eyes. He didn't say anything, he just nodded. One time, and she understood it completely. It was one sniper acknowledging another. It was the whole conversation said without a single word. She climbed down off the rocks on legs that shook, and Marcus caught up to her before he boarded, and he took Sullivan's rifle out of her hands gently, almost reverently. "He's going to want to thank you himself when he's out of surgery," Marcus said. His face was gray with his own pain, but his eyes were clear. "You pulled all our asses out of the fire tonight, Grant. Don't let anybody tell you different." She opened her mouth to say something, but he wasn't finished. He limped a step toward the helicopter and then turned back. "And you might want to see the doc about that concussion. You've got a head wound bleeding all down your neck." She touched her scalp, and her hand came away red, and she blinked at it because she genuinely hadn't noticed. Funny, she thought, how pain just stops existing when you're busy surviving. The flight back to Griffin took 20 minutes. She sat by the open door and watched the battlefield shrink and fall away beneath her. Bodies scattered across the sand, smoke curling up from the wreck of the Black Hawk, brass casings catching the first light. And she thought about the faces she'd seen through the scope, and she wondered if they had children. If there were women somewhere who would wait and never know for certain what had happened. And then she pushed those thoughts down hard because she already understood without anyone telling her that walking down that road led to a place you didn't come back from. Morse had tried to warn her, the weight you carry, the faces in the dark. She hadn't understood him then. She was starting to understand him now. Back at the base, everything came at her in a blur. Medical processing, a doctor shining a light in her eyes and asking her the date, her name, how many fingers, and she got them all right, and it felt like the smallest possible victory. 8 stitches in her cheek, 12 more in her scalp, anti-nausea medication for the concussion, orders for 48 hours of rest. She nodded to all of it and agreed to all of it. And then she went to her bunk and lay down in her filthy uniform and stared at the ceiling while her mind played back every single shot in perfect, merciless detail. The first man, wispy beard, maybe 20 years old, setting up the PKM center mass, down. The second, the runner, mid-30s, a scar, visible even at 300 yards, led him perfectly, down mid-stride. The commander, gray in his beard authority and the way he stood, and the whole attack falling apart behind him. How many more she'd lost count after 7 or 8, but every face was burned into her with a clarity that would not fade, and she lay there and let them come one after another, young and old, scared and calm, all dead by her hand. Sleep didn't come. Not close. Her body was wrecked, but her mind ran like an engine stuck wide open, and every time she shut her eyes, she saw the scope, the crosshairs settling on a living man, the kick of recoil, the certainty that another human being had stopped existing because of her. At 0400, she gave up. She walked through the pre-dawn dark to the shower and turned the water up until it scalded, and she stood under it and scrubbed the dried blood out of her hair and watched the water run pink toward the drain. She scrubbed until her skin went raw, until the water ran clear, and she still didn't feel clean, and she wondered standing there whether she ever would again. The mess hall was nearly empty at 0530. She poured herself a cup of coffee that tasted like battery acid mixed with motor oil and took it to a corner table, and she sat there and watched the sun come up over the blast barriers. Other soldiers began to drift in, and some of them glanced at her, and she felt it. Word had already gone through the base, the logistics specialist who'd become a sniper. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just the quiet girl who counted bullets. People saw her differently now, and she hated it because they were looking at her like she was something she didn't feel like at all. She wasn't a warrior. She was somebody who'd picked up a rifle because there was no other choice in the whole world. She'd done what needed doing, and now she had to live with it, and she didn't want anybody looking at her like it made her special. Footsteps came toward her table, and she looked up, and Master Sergeant Callahan Morse was standing there. He didn't ask permission. He sat down heavily, his bad legs stretched out to the side, and his weathered old face was creased with concern. "How you holding up, kid?" She shrugged and she sipped her terrible coffee. "I'm fine." "That's a lie." His voice was gentle, but there was no giving it. Nobody's fine after their first combat, not ever. They sat in silence while the mess hall filled up around them, Trey's clattering voices rising, the ordinary noise of military life going on like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't cracked open just a few hours before. Then Morse spoke, and he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his coffee cup like it held some kind of answer. "Grenada, 1983. I was 37 years old. First time I ever killed a man through a scope." She turned to look at him. "Insurgent at 600 yards. Clear shot, perfect conditions. I pulled the trigger and he dropped." Morse's jaw tightened, and then I crawled behind my position and I threw up, heaved my guts out into the dirt while my spotter pretended not to notice. He looked up at her and his eyes were wet. Nightmares for months after, his face over and over, wondering if I could have wounded him instead, wondering if he had kids, whether his wife cried when they told her. He stopped. The guilt damn near broke me in half, and something loosened in Inslee's chest. The knowledge that this hard legendary man had felt the exact thing crawling through her right now. "Does it get easier?" Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "No." He didn't hesitate. He gave it to her straight. "It never gets easier, but you learn to carry the weight better. You learn to put those faces in a box and only open it when you're in a place where you can handle it." He leaned forward across the table. "Here's what you need to hear, and you need to actually hear it. You did the right thing for the right reasons. Those men were trying to kill your team. You stopped them. That is not murder, Grant. That's war. And war is ugly, and it's horrible, and sometimes it's the only thing standing between the people you love and the people who'd kill them. I keep seeing them, Sergeant. She barely got it out. Every time I close my eyes. You will, for a long time, maybe forever. He reached across the table and put his rough hand over hers. But you're still you. You're still the girl from Montana who counts bullets twice because she can't stand a number that doesn't add up. What you did last night doesn't erase that. It gets added to it. He pulled his hand back and took a drink of coffee and made a face at the taste. I lost my daughter because I never learned to process this stuff, he said quietly. Never talked about it. Kept it locked up inside and it poisoned everything I touched until there was nothing left in me for the people who actually needed it. His voice cracked just slightly. Don't make my mistakes, Inslee. Don't let this thing eat you from the inside out. The use of her first name hit her somewhere she didn't have a defense for. He'd always called her Grant or Kid. This was something else. This was a father talking to a daughter. Teaching you, he said, and now the tears were running down the deep lines of his face and he wasn't bothering to hide them. Has been the closest thing to redemption I'm ever going to get. Watching you find out what you're made of. That matters to me more than you will ever know. Her own eyes filled and she looked down at the table. I almost got people killed. I froze, Sergeant. Before I picked up that rifle, I froze for a second. But you didn't freeze long. You acted. His voice went fierce. And that action saved Sullivan's life, saved Marcus, saved Garrett, and every man on that team. 1 second of hesitation is human. What matters is what you did in the second after. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, and he told her more. His first kill, his worst kill, the men he'd lost and never stopped counting, the weight he'd carried every single day for a quarter of a century. He gave it to her with a brutal honesty she'd never heard from anyone, and slowly sitting in that mess hall over the worst coffee in Afghanistan, she began to understand that what she felt wasn't a defect in her. It was the price of doing something that actually mattered. What do I do now? She asked finally. You keep moving forward, one day at a time. You process it. You acknowledge the weight instead of pretending it isn't there, and you decide what kind of person you want to be from here. He pushed himself up, stiff, wincing on the bad leg. I've got paperwork to file, but I want you to think about something for me. You found out last night that you're capable of things most people never touch. The only question left is whether you develop it or whether you walk away from it. And he walked off before she could answer and left her alone with her thoughts and her cold, terrible coffee, and a question she could already feel there was only one answer to. The next 3 days passed in a fog she couldn't seem to burn off. She tried to go back to logistics. She sat in the supply depot and stared at the spreadsheets, and the numbers had gone dead on her. 7,200 rounds. Who cared? She'd fired maybe 20 rounds one night and changed the outcome of a whole battle. Counting bullets felt absurd now. Trivial. Like being asked to color inside the lines after you'd seen what the crayons could really do. On the 4th day, Lieutenant Garrett requested a formal meeting. She reported to his office at 1400, and her stomach was in knots the whole walk over because she didn't know what to expect. His office was spare and organized maps on the walls, a single photograph of him with his team, nothing else that spoke of a life. He gestured for her to sit. How are you healing? No small talk. Straight in. Stitches itch. Concussion's better. I'm cleared for duty, sir. He nodded, shuffled some papers, then looked up and put his eyes right on her. I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star with Valor device. She opened her mouth. Your actions during Operation Valkyrie saved multiple lives. He went on riding right over her. Without somebody manning that sniper position after Sullivan went down, we'd have been overrun. That's not opinion, that's fact. Sir, he held up a hand. I've written hundreds of award citations, Grant. I know what merits recognition. What you did was exceptional. Period. He leaned back in his chair. But that's not why I called you in here. He picked up a folder and set it in front of him. I've been going through your training records, your qualification scores, your evaluations from Master Sergeant Morse. He looked at her. You've got natural talent behind a rifle. Significant talent. The kind that has no business being wasted counting supplies in a warehouse. And there it was. She'd felt it coming since she sat down. The offer, the fork in the road. Have you ever considered transferring to a combat specialty sniper school? Precision marksman courses. I've thought about it. She kept her voice flat, careful. But I like logistics. It's important work. I'm good at it. You're adequate at logistics? Garrett said it without cruelty, just fact. You're exceptional at shooting. There's a difference, and you know there's a difference. His voice hardened. Combat doesn't care about your job title, Grant. When the situation demands action, you either step up or people die. You stepped up. That shows character. That shows courage. He set the folder down and squared it with the edge of the desk. I'll support whatever you decide. You want to stay in logistics, that's your right, and I'll sign off on it and never mention it again. But I want you to really think about it. Not knee-jerk fear, actual honest consideration of what you're capable of. She felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders. Stay safe, count bullets, live a life she could predict down to the last decimal, or reach for something terrifying and full of purpose that might break her in half. How long do I have? 1 week. After that, I need an answer. He stood, which meant they were done. Talk to the people you trust. Think it through. Then make the choice you can live with. She left his office more turned around than when she'd walked in. Her feet carried her back to the supply depot out of pure habit, and she sat at her desk and stared at the inventory, and 3 hours later, she'd done nothing. The numbers swam together. Her mind kept circling the same handful of questions like water going down a drain. Could she really go back to this after what she'd been through? Could she sit safe in a warehouse knowing she had a skill in her hands that could keep men alive out there? Would the boredom kill her slow, or would the guilt of wasting it eat her alive? That evening, she went to find Marcus at the medical facility. He was wrapping a soldier's sprained ankle when she came in, and when he finished, he waved her into his cramped little office, and they sat down surrounded by supplies and anatomy posters. He looked tired but healthier. His leg was mending, though he still moved with a limp. What's on your mind, Grant? She laid it all out. Garrett's offer, the choice between safe and meaningful. The fear underneath both of them, the fear of becoming somebody who could kill without it costing her anything, and right alongside it, the opposite fear of throwing away the one thing she'd turned out to be truly good at. Marcus listened without cutting in once. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I came in as a regular medic, he said finally. No combat ambitions. I just wanted to help people. Then my first deployment, we got hit. Hard. Mass casualty, and I found myself treating wounds under fire. Bullets everywhere, people screaming for their mothers, total chaos. He looked down at his own hands. And I was good at it, calm when everything else was falling apart, making triage calls in seconds, deciding who I could save and who I couldn't. I kept 11 men alive that day, lost 3. What did you do after trained as a combat medic? Never looked back once. He raised his eyes to hers. Because I found something out about myself that day. I'm not just good under pressure. I'm necessary. My hands keep people breathing who would otherwise die. How the hell do you walk away from that once you know it about yourself? He leaned forward. The question isn't whether you can do the job, Grant. You already proved you can. You did it under conditions that break trained men. The question is whether you want to. And nobody on this earth can answer that for you but you. She left the medical facility and walked the perimeter of the base, and she watched the sun go down over the desert, and then she found a satellite phone, and she called home. Her mother picked up on the 3rd ring. Honey, are you okay? You sound tired. I'm fine, Mom, just been busy. And she couldn't tell her. She couldn't say a single word about the crash or the rifle or the faces. How's Dad? Same as always. Back's still bothering him. He's watching TV right now. You want to talk to him? No, that's okay. I just wanted to hear your voice. They talked about nothing for 20 minutes. Her brother's classes, the weather back in Butte, some feud 2 neighbors were having over a fence line. Normal life going on in a world that felt like it was on the far side of the moon. And when she hung up, the loneliness came down on her like a physical thing. Her family would never understand what she'd been through. They couldn't. How do you explain putting a crosshair on a living man? How do you describe the weight of watching people die by your own hand and then getting up and eating breakfast? Some experiences build walls between you and the people you love, and there is no door in that wall and no words to knock one through it. She was alone with this, completely alone, and she was going to have to decide it alone. The next 2 days, she threw herself at training like she could outrun the question. She went to the range every evening and fired hundreds of rounds. She ran long distances under a heavy pack until her legs shook. She tried to wreck her own body badly enough that sleep would have to come and take her without the faces waiting behind her eyes. It didn't work. The faces still came, but something was shifting. They were getting less sharp, less immediate, starting to sink down into the background noise of memory instead of standing right at the front of it, and she wasn't sure whether that was mercy or a warning. On the 6th day, Morse found her at the range. He watched her shoot for 30 minutes without saying a word, just observed her form, her breathing, the tight little clusters she was punching through the paper. And when she finally ran her last magazine dry and lowered the rifle, he spoke. "You shoot differently now." He said it plainly. "More efficient, no wasted movement." He paused. "Combat does that, burns off everything that isn't necessary." She set the rifle down carefully. "I can't go back to counting bullets, Sergeant. I've tried. It feels meaningless now." "Then don't go back." Matter of fact, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Some people are born for a certain thing, Grant. You were born for this. Circumstances just came along and showed it to you. What if I fail? What if I can't handle sniper school? You already handled the worst moment there is. School is just school." He handed her a water bottle. "You've been operating under live fire with men's lives in your hands. Everything after that is easier by comparison. What if I become somebody who kills without feeling it?" The real fear out loud at last. "What if I lose myself in this?" And Morse's face softened in a way she rarely saw. "That's actually a good sign," he said. "It means you've still got your humanity intact. The day you stop worrying about that question is the day you've actually lost yourself. As long as it keeps you up at night, you're safe." He lowered himself onto a bench and gestured for her to sit beside him. "Listen to me carefully, because this is the whole thing. You will carry those faces forever. That's the price, and there's no getting out of paying it. But you also carry something else. You carry the knowledge that you kept Sullivan alive, that Marcus made it home, that Garrett and his whole team have families they're going to see again." His voice went fierce and low. "Those men have kids who still have fathers because of what you did on that rock. That counts. Put it on the scale against the faces and you tell me which side is heavier." She felt something move inside her chest, a weight settling not into nothing but into its proper place. "I want to do this," she said quietly. "I want to go to sniper school. I want to develop it." And Morse smiled, the first real smile she'd ever seen from him. "Then do it," he said, "and don't look back." The next morning, she walked into Garrett's office. He looked up from his paperwork. "I want sniper school, sir, if the offer still stands." His expression didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes. Satisfaction, or maybe just being proven right. "Already started the paperwork," he said. "Had a feeling you'd get here." He pulled out a folder. "Army Sniper School at Fort Benning. 7 weeks. One of the highest failure rates in the entire military. You will be pushed harder than you have ever been pushed in your life." "I understand, sir." "Do you—" He came around the desk. "This isn't a hobby. This is a complete change in who you are. You'll be taking life on a regular basis, carrying weight most people can't even imagine. There's no going back once you commit to this road." She met his eyes and held them. "I'm already carrying the weight, sir. Might as well learn to carry it, right?" He nodded slow. "Report date is December 15th. That gives you 3 months to prepare. I'd use every day of it." Over the next 12 weeks, she took herself apart and rebuilt herself into something new. She ran 6 miles every morning under a 60-pound pack. She trained with Morse every evening on advanced ballistics, on reading wind, on the Coriolis effect, and how the Earth's own spin nudges a bullet at extreme range. Morse gave her everything in that notebook, and everything that had never made it into the notebook: lessons out of Grenada and Panama, and Desert Storm wisdom bought with blood and mistakes, and he held nothing back. It was as if he was pouring 25 years into her as fast as she could take it, like he knew there was a clock running that only he could hear. The night before she flew out to Benning Morse met her at the flight line. It was 0600, a cold desert morning, and the C-13 sat on the tarmac with its engines already warming. They stood facing each other, the old warrior and the young one, the teacher and the student, the father figure and the daughter he'd found when the one he'd lost was already gone. "Make me proud, kid," Morse said, and his voice was thick. "I will, Sergeant." Her eyes burned and she refused to let a single tear fall. "I promise." He raised his hand in a salute, formal, final, and she returned it crisp and sharp, and then she turned and walked up the cargo ramp, and she did not look back because she knew that if she looked back, it would break her. The C-13 lifted off, and she watched through a window as Griffin shrank away beneath her, and Morse's silhouette stood alone on the tarmac until the whole base disappeared into the distance. And then she faced forward. Fort Benning was waiting. Sniper school was waiting. A future she'd never once imagined for herself was waiting out there in the dark, and she was going to walk straight into it. Fort Benning, Georgia hit her like a slap. After months in the dry Afghan heat, the Georgia humidity felt like trying to breathe through a wet wool blanket. Rain came down in cold sheets. Everything was green and dense and wrong wooded terrain that looked nothing like the arid ground where she'd learned her trade. She reported on December 16, 2012, carrying one duffel bag, and Morse's leather notebook and 25 other students stood in formation outside the sniper school headquarters. Most were men, infantry veterans with multiple deployments behind them, Rangers with combat patches on their shoulders, Marines who looked like they'd been chiseled out of granite. There were two other women in the formation, one tall and angular with short blonde hair, the other compact and hard-muscled with skin dark as mahogany. Nobody acknowledged anybody. Everyone was too busy measuring the competition, doing the math on who'd wash out first. A man came out of the headquarters building, and he moved with the economical grace of somebody who'd spent decades in combat and had nothing left to prove to anyone. Mid-40s, a scarred face with a nose that had been broken more than once, missing the pinky finger off his left hand, and eyes that were flat and hard and evaluating. "I am Sergeant First Class Declan Harrow," he said, and his voice carried across the whole formation without him raising it at all. "I will be your lead instructor for the next 7 weeks. I do not give a damn about your background, your rank, or your gender. You are all equally worthless to me until you prove otherwise through performance." He paced slowly down the line and stopped in front of a big ranger standing at rigid attention. "This course has a 70% failure rate. Most of you will wash out. That is not a threat. It is a statistical fact." He kept pacing. "You will be pushed past your limits, sleep-deprived, underfed, and tested in ways that will break your body and then start working on your mind. The only question that matters here is whether you have the will to keep going when every single cell in your body is screaming at you to quit." He stopped dead in the center of the formation. "There are no participation trophies here. No credit for trying hard. You either meet the standard or you fail. Welcome to hell." The first week was marksmanship fundamentals, and it opened with a 300-yard qualification on day 1. 8 out of 10 hits minimum, or you were gone. She watched 3 students fail before lunch. Their shots scattered across the targets in patterns that told the whole story about their technique, and they were pulled out for remedial training and probably would never come back. And Inslee shot 10 out of 10. Perfect. Down the line, the blonde woman also shot perfect, and for the first time, the two of them made eye contact. A brief acknowledgement. No words, none needed. Harrow walked the firing line checking targets, and he stopped at hers. He studied the tight little cluster she'd put through the center of the paper, and then he looked at her face at the healing scar the stone fragments had left on her cheek. He didn't say anything. He just moved on. But she saw it register in his eyes. He knew she'd seen combat. He knew that scar hadn't come from a classroom. The weapons education was relentless. The M24 sniper system, bolt action 7.62, effective range 800 meters. They stripped it and reassembled it, blindfolded until their fingers knew every part in the dark. Every component, every failure point, how to clear a malfunction when you couldn't see your own hands. The M11 felt like an old friend in her grip. She'd fired Sullivan's rifle under conditions no classroom could ever manufacture, and this tame version on a clean bench felt almost gentle by comparison. She worked the action with a confidence the other students hadn't earned yet, a confidence bought in the dark on a pile of rocks in Afghanistan. Week 2 brought fieldcraft, and it started with building a ghillie suit out of burlap and natural vegetation. And here her whole nature paid off. She measured the thread spacing with the same obsessive precision she'd once brought to an ammunition log. She matched her colors exactly to the Georgia undergrowth. She built a suit that vanished into the forest floor. Harrow examined her work and stared at it for a long moment. "This looks like something out of a museum," he said. "Well done, Grant." It was the first praise she'd heard him give anyone, and it landed on her like a medal. And then came the stalking exercises, and that was where her confidence turned into something dangerous. The task looked simple on paper. Move 150 meters through the woods toward 2 Walker instructors who were actively hunting for students. Reach a firing position without being detected. 3-hour time limit, and she had shot perfect all week. She'd built the best ghillie suit in the class. She'd already proven herself in actual combat. This felt almost beneath her. So she moved too fast, impatient to show them what she was certain her natural talent would carry her the way it had carried her onto that rock. At 100 meters, a Walker blew his whistle. Sharp, loud, final. "Busted. Stand up, student." She stood, and mud and dead leaves fell off her ruined ghillie suit, and her face burned so hot she thought it might catch fire. The Walker came over. He was older, gray in his hair, with eyes that had seen everything the Army had to offer and were unimpressed by all of it. "What's your name?" "Grant, Sergeant." "Well, Grant, you just got yourself and your entire team killed. Your impatience, your overconfidence, your failure to respect the fundamentals." He pointed back toward the start line. "Walk back and think about what you did wrong the whole way." The walk of shame took forever. Other students watched from concealment, and she felt every set of eyes tracking her, felt the judgment coming off them. The combat veteran who couldn't handle a basic stalk. Harrow was waiting at the start line, and his face was worse than anger. It was disappointment. "What happened out there, Grant?" "I moved too fast, Sergeant First Class. I was overconfident." "Yes, you were." He crossed his arms. "Combat gave you a false sense of your own ability. You think because you did it once under fire, you've mastered the fundamentals. You haven't. You got lucky out there in Afghanistan, and luck runs out. It always runs out. And the day it run out for a sniper is the last day of a sniper's life." The words hit harder than any curse could have because they were true, and she knew they were true. That night, she lay in her bunk and replayed the failure on a loop. The whistle, the walk back, the disappointment on Harrow's face. She had held the line under fire and killed men who were trying to kill her, and she'd just been beaten by a training exercise a first-week private could pass. What did that say about how good she actually was? Maybe Morse had been wrong about her. Maybe she didn't belong here at all. The next morning at breakfast, a student sat down across from her without asking. He was older than most early 30s, an infantry patch on his shoulder, lean and weathered with a pair of kind eyes. "Saw you get walked yesterday," he said. "I'm Brixton Fallon. Everybody calls me Brick." He took a bite of the terrible scrambled eggs. "Happened to me on my first attempt, too. Happens to most people who come in here thinking they already know something." "How'd you pass the retest?" "Slowed down, trusted the process." He shrugged. "Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Rushing gets you killed, or in our case, gets you walked." And over the next 3 days, she did the only thing she knew how to do when she failed at something. She attacked it obsessively. She spent 8 hours at a stretch in those woods, moving at a glacial crawl. She lay motionless in the underbrush while mosquitoes covered every inch of her exposed skin, and she did not scratch, did not move, just breathed and waited and learned patience down at the cellular level. Patience defeats panic. Morse's words over and over in her head. The retest came on January 2nd. Same course, same walkers, a different Ann Inslee Grant. She took 2 hours and 40 minutes to cross 150 meters. She moved 6 inches at a time at the slowest points. She froze completely dead still when a walker passed within 10 feet of her position, holding her breath until she thought her lungs would burst. She stopped being a thing moving through the forest and became part of the forest itself. She reached the firing position undetected, settled in behind the rifle, and put the crosshairs dead on the target. Harrow was waiting at the extraction point, and he looked at her differently now. The disappointment was gone, replaced by something harder to name. something closer to respect. Better, he said, much better. And then he did something she hadn't seen him do. He smiled, small, brief, but real. You learned the lesson. And she understood, standing there covered in mud with her heart still hammering, that the fundamentals didn't care how many men you killed. That the rifle didn't care that she'd been a hero for one night on one rock. Every day out here, she was going to have to earn it again from nothing, and that lesson, more than any target she'd ever hit, was the one that was going to keep her alive. Week 3 arrived and brought sleep deprivation with it, and that was when the school stopped testing her body and started coming after her mind. The wake-ups came at random hours in the dead of night. 0200, 0330, 0445. A voice barking in the dark, and then the whole class stumbling into full gear, sometimes a 4-mile run, followed immediately by weapons qualification, because the entire point was to find out whether they could still shoot straight when their bodies had nothing left to give. And Ann Inslee discovered fast that exhaustion made everything harder. Her hands trembled. Her vision blurred at the edges. Simple wind calculations that took her 10 seconds when rested took 30 when she'd been dragged out of a dead sleep. But Morse had trained her for this without either of them naming it. Those evening sessions in the Afghan dark when he'd pushed her until she could barely keep her feet under her and then made her shoot anyway. The muscle memory held even when the thinking part of her brain had gone offline, and she made her shots when other students were scattering rounds across the paper. The class kept shrinking. 26 had become 21. 2 injuries, 2 voluntary withdrawals, men who simply walked into the office one morning and said they were done. 1 academic failure, a ranger who couldn't hold his windage math together under the pressure and the fatigue. And Ann Inslee watched every departure with the same tangled knot of feelings. Relief that she was still standing, and under it colder the fear that she might be next. One morning she watched them take the blonde woman, the one who'd shot perfect right alongside her that first day. Not a washout, a stress fracture in her lower leg that finally gave out on a run, and she came off the field on a medic's shoulder, gray-faced, trying not to cry in front of the others and losing that fight. She caught Ann Inslee's eye as they carried her past, and there was nothing to say, so neither of them said anything. But Ann Inslee felt it land in her chest like a stone. If it could take a shooter that good, it could take anybody. It could take her. Week 4 brought nutritional restriction. MRRS, only a deliberate calorie deficit built to simulate field conditions where the food ran out and the mission went on anyway. She lost 8 pounds in 2 weeks. Her uniform hung loose off her shoulders. Her face went gaunt, cheekbones standing out sharp. But her shooting stayed clean, and she began to understand something Harrow had been trying to hammer into all of them from the first day. The rifle didn't care how she felt. The rifle only cared what she did. Week 5 brought urban operations, and here for the first time since the stalking failure, she felt the ground come solid under her feet. They built a mock city out on the training grounds. 3-story buildings, narrow alleys, limited sight lines that closed off and opened up as you moved. Moving vehicles, pop-up targets that appeared and vanished in seconds. And this was where her mathematical mind came alive, because urban shooting was geometry, and geometry had always spoken to her. Calculating angles through building windows, compensating for elevation changes floor to floor, reading wind that broke and swirled through the concrete canyons instead of running clean across open ground. 3rd floor window, she murmured to herself on one run, the calculations rolling out automatic. 15-degree downward angle, 280 meters, wind negligible in the corridor. She fired. Clean hit. Harrow watched from behind, her arms crossed. Your mind works fast, Grant. Good instincts for geometry. And then came the critical test. January 24th, 10 shots, 10 different urban scenarios. 8 out of 10 minimum to continue, or she was recycled, 7 weeks of suffering, gone to nothing. She walked to the firing line feeling good. Confident, but not overconfident. She'd learned that lesson in the mud with a whistle screaming in her face, and she carried it now like a scar. Shot 1, clean hit. Shot 2, hit. Shot 3, miss. She'd misjudged the wind through a gap between 2 buildings, and the bullet drifted 6 inches right. She felt something cold open up in her stomach. She pushed it down. Breathed, refocused. Shot 4, hit. Shot 5, miss. She flinched on the trigger, pulled it instead of squeezing it. A rookie mistake, the exact mistake she'd corrected in the first week, and now here it was crawling back out of her under the pressure. And the cold thing in her stomach grew teeth. 2 misses. She could afford exactly one more. One more, and she was finished. Shot 6. Miss. A complete mental blank. She forgot to compensate for elevation entirely, and the bullet struck 2 feet low, and she knew it the instant it left the barrel. 3 misses. 7 out of 10. Failure. She lowered the rifle and everything inside her went numb. Around her, the other students were finishing their qualifications. Brick shot 9 out of 10. Another shooter finished clean. And Inslee Grant, the woman who had held the line under fire, the woman with the healing combat scar on her cheek, had just failed a training qualification with 4 shots left in the string. She didn't even need to fire because there was no point anymore. Harrow walked over. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just looked at her with that devastating, quiet disappointment that was so much worse than any screaming. See me after formation, Grant. The rest of the day passed in a fog. Classes on range estimation. Practical exercises on wind. She went through all of it on autopilot while her mind gnawed on those 3 shots, and the truth of what had happened slowly came clear to her, and it terrified her more than the failure itself. The problem hadn't been technical. Her fundamentals were sound. The problem had been mental. She had choked. She had let the fear of failing become the thing that made her fail, and that was a poison she didn't know how to bleed out of herself. After formation, she reported to Harrow's office. He sat behind a desk, buried in paperwork and range cards, and he gestured for her to sit. You want to tell me what happened out there? I choked Sergeant First Class, lost focus, made mistakes I know better than to make. Why? His eyes cut into her. You've operated under actual combat conditions. You've killed enemy fighters while their bullets were snapping past your head. So tell me, why did a simple qualification break you? She didn't have an answer, or she had one and didn't want to say it out loud. I don't know, Sergeant First Class. Yes, you do. He leaned forward across the desk. You are exhausted, sleep-deprived, undernourished. Your body is breaking down and your mind is following it right off the cliff. This is exactly what this course is built to do, Grant. Find your breaking point. See whether you quit or whether you push through. He stood up. You have 1 retest tomorrow. Same qualification. You fail again, you're recycled. Might join the next class, might not. That's up to you to decide whether you've got what it takes. She left his office hollowed out. She walked back to the barracks through the cold Georgia rain, and other students were cleaning weapons and studying and sleeping, and she sat on the edge of her bunk and stared at the wall. She could quit. The thought came to her plain and clear, and it wasn't even the first time. She could walk into that office tomorrow and tell them this wasn't for her. Go back to logistics, count bullets, live a safe, quiet, predictable life where nobody's death was ever on her hands and nobody's life depended on whether she flinched. And nobody would blame her. Sniper school beat better soldiers than her every single week. There was no shame in it. Everyone said so. At 2100 hours, she pulled Morse's notebook out from under her pillow. She flipped through the pages of 25 years of hard-won wisdom. Wind drift tables, range estimation, the careful cramped handwriting, and she came to the inside of the back cover and she read the inscription she had read a dozen times before. But tonight the words landed on her like they'd been written that afternoon. An Inslee, you'll hit a wall. Everyone does. When you want to quit, remember the only failure is stopping before you're finished. Everything else is just a temporary setback. You've got this. You've always had this. Callahan Morse. He had known. Sitting in the Afghan heat 3 months ago before she'd even flown out, he had known she would arrive at this exact moment. This crisis. This night where quitting looked easier than continuing. And he had left this message for her to find planted in that notebook, like a letter mailed into the future, a hand reaching across 5,000 miles to grab her by the collar right before she went over the edge. She sat with the notebook open in her lap for a long time. And then she stood up and she grabbed her rifle case and she walked out into the rain toward the night range. The range safety officer wasn't expecting anyone at that hour, but he unlocked the facility without a single question when he saw her face and she spent 2 hours in the dark running dry fire drills. No ammunition, no targets, just the mechanics. Breathe, trigger press, follow through, over and over and over until the movements went automatic again, until the thinking mind that had betrayed her went quiet and the trained body underneath it took the wheel. At 01:30, she went back to the barracks and slept for 3 hours, and it was the best sleep she'd had in days. The retest was at 0800. Same course, same 10 scenarios, a different woman standing on the line. She approached it exactly the way she'd approached that stalking retest weeks before. Slow, methodical, no rushing, no panic. Just the fundamentals executed one at a time, each one its own small task with no thought spared for the ones before or the ones to come. Shot 1, hit. Shot 2, hit. Shot 3, hit. She compensated for the win through the gap correctly, this time held right into it. Shot 4, hit. Shot 5, hit. Smooth trigger press, no flinch. Shot 6, hit. Perfect elevation, compensation, the drop calculated cold and applied clean. She ran through all 10. 10 hits. A perfect score. Harrow examined the target and then he looked at her face and he did not smile this time. "There's the shooter I expected," he said, and then quieter with something like a warning in it. "Don't you disappear on me again." Week 6 brought advanced fieldcraft multi-day exercises with almost no support, and the students operated in pairs, now running simulated missions across the Georgia backwoods. Ann Inslee drew Brick as her partner, and the two of them fit together better than either had expected. His years of infantry work filled the gaps in her tactical knowledge. Her mathematical mind filled the gaps in his navigation. They spent 48 straight hours in the field on limited food and no sleep, moving through terrain while the instructors actively hunted them, setting up firing positions, engaging targets at extreme range, and slipping out again undetected. At one point, hunkered in a hide with the rain coming down and both of them soaked to the skin, Brick looked over at her. "You're different since that qualification failure," he said quietly. "Steadier somehow. Before you had this thing where you were always trying to prove something. That's gone now. Had to break before I could be whole." She kept her eyes on the terrain, scanning through the binoculars. "Needed to remember I'm not special. I'm just somebody willing to do the work." Brick was quiet for a second. "That's exactly what makes you special," he said. And week 7 brought the final exercise, the thing all 7 weeks of suffering had been building toward. 48 hours, a partner operation. A scenario as close to real as training could make it, and failing it meant recycling the entire course. 7 weeks of hell thrown away to start again from day one. She and Brick got their briefing at 2100 on February 3rd. Infiltrate a simulated enemy compound. Identify specific targets. Engage from concealment at ranges past 300 meters. Exfiltrate undetected while Walker instructors hunted them the whole way. They inserted at night into the Georgia woods, 38 degrees, a light rain falling, visibility down to almost nothing. 4 miles to the compound through terrain that would either hide them or hang them, depending entirely on how good they were. Ann Inslee led the navigation using terrain features and a pace count, no GPS, no electronic aids, just a map and a compass, and techniques older than she was that still worked because the ground didn't change. They moved at a glacial crawl, 6 hours to cover 4 miles. Walkers passed within 20 feet of them more than once and never saw a thing. At 0300 on February 4th, they reached their overwatch position 380 meters from the compound, good concealment, multiple routes back out. They settled into their hide and they waited. 11 and a half hours motionless. The rain kept falling. The temperature dropped to 35 degrees and Ann Inslee's body went numb from the cold and the stillness combined, and it didn't matter. Patience defeats panic. She had the words carved into her now. Brick struggled with it more than she did. Infantrymen were built for movement, for decisive action, and waiting without purpose ran against every instinct he had. But he trusted the process. He held still. He let the discomfort exist without fighting it, and that too was a lesson, and she watched him learn it in real time. At 14:30, their target appeared. A role player walking into the compound courtyard. Range confirmed at 382 meters. Wind pushing left to right at 6 miles an hour. Temperature and humidity already calculated hours before sitting ready in her head. She made the final adjustments. Windage. Elevation. Her breathing slowed to almost nothing, in and out through her nose, quiet as sleep. The crosshairs settled. Her finger took up the slack. The shot broke clean. Through the scope, she watched the simulation round strike center mass, and she felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a job done right. Brick fired 8 seconds later. Also clean. And then they were moving because the walkers would converge on the compound within minutes, and they had to be fast and they had to be invisible at the same time, and those two things pull against each other every step of the way. 8 miles to the extraction point by a longer, more concealed route. They moved like ghosts. They used every fold in the ground, every shadow, every piece of terrain the map had promised them. Walkers passed them multiple times. Once one came within 5 feet, close enough that Ann Ensley could hear him breathing, and she stopped being a person and became a rock. A bush, a piece of the dark, and he walked right past and never knew she was there. They reached extraction at 2200 hours, 14 hours after they had inserted completely undetected. The observer instructor at the extraction point actually smiled, which she'd been told almost never happened. "That was textbook," he said. "One of the best stalking and shooting combinations I've seen come through in recent classes. Well done." Graduation day arrived on February 8th. Cold and clear, 26 students had started, 9 stood in formation to receive their sniper tabs, a 65% failure rate higher than average. A brutal class, everyone agreed, one of the hard ones. And Inslee stood at attention as the commandant came down the line, and he pinned the tab to her uniform, a small piece of cloth that stood for 7 weeks of suffering and hundreds of hours of training and every limit she'd found and then pushed straight through. "Congratulations, Specialist Grant. You are now a qualified United States Army sniper." Her parents watched over a video link they'd set up at the family readiness office. Her mother cried openly. Her father sat there speechless, staring at the screen, and she couldn't tell whether it was pride or fear or both, and maybe there was no difference anymore. Her brother sent her a text a minute later that made her laugh out loud right there in formation. "You're officially the scariest person I know." After the ceremony, Lieutenant Garrett appeared, and she hadn't known he was coming. The SEAL team leader had flown all the way from California specifically for her graduation. "SEALs don't forget their debts," he said, and he pressed a challenge coin into her hand, a trident on one side, a team number on the other. "You saved Sullivan's life. Mine. Everybody's on that rock. That makes you family, always." He offered his hand and she shook it. "Doors are open, Grant. You ever want to come work in our world, you just say the word." "I appreciate it, sir." And she meant it. "But I think I found my path." He nodded, he understood. And more than that, he respected it, and she could see the respect in his face, and it was worth more to her than the offer. And then a voice she knew came from behind her. "Heard somebody graduated sniper school." She turned around and Corporal Garrett Sullivan was standing there. In his dress uniform, his left arm still in a sling but standing tall. The Montana sniper. The man who'd been hit on that rock in Operation Valkyrie, whose rifle she had picked up out of the dirt. Reaper. She hadn't known he'd come. She hadn't even known he was out of rehab. "Took me a while to track you down," he said, and he extended his good hand. "Wanted to say thank you in person. You gave me a chance to watch my kids grow up. There's not a word big enough for what that's worth." They shook hands. 2 snipers, both born in the same cold Montana mountains, both forged in the same fire on the same night. "You earned this," Sullivan said, and he handed her something small. A scope ring, scarred, battle-worn metal. "That's off the rifle from that night. Carried it through 3 deployments. Figure you earned the right to carry it forward." Her throat closed up. "I can't take this." "Already got a new one," he smiled. "Besides, every time you look through a scope, I want you to remember something. We hold the line. All of us." He came to attention and saluted her one time, and then he walked away. That evening, she called Afghanistan on a satellite phone. It took 15 minutes to get patched through to Griffin and another 10 for somebody to physically locate Morse and get him to a handset. And when that gravel voice finally came crackling down the line, her eyes started to burn. "Grant, that's you, kid? Just wanted to let you know I graduated sergeant. 9 out of 26 made it. I was one of them." There was silence on the line, and then his voice came back thick, wrecked with feeling he didn't try to hide. "Told you so," he said. "Knew you had it." He paused. "I'm proud of you and Inslee. Your father should be too." "I almost quit, Sergeant. Week 5. I had the notebook in my lap, and I was ready to walk away. Then I read what you wrote in the back. But you didn't walk away. That's the whole thing right there. You chose to stay. Another pause, and when he came back, his voice had cracked wide open. And Grant, thank you for letting me be a part of this, for giving me the chance to do it right with somebody. And she understood exactly what he meant, and it broke something loose in her chest. She had given him redemption, a chance to mentor someone the whole way through, to do for her what he had failed to do for the daughter who wouldn't take his calls. Thank you for believing in me, she said when I couldn't believe in myself. They talked another 10 minutes, and then the static rose up and swallowed the connection, and he was gone, and she sat there in the Georgia dark, holding a dead phone against her ear, not wanting to be the one to hang it up. Her deployment orders came the next day. 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, precision marksman attached to direct action teams. Deploy date April 2013. Back to Afghanistan. Back in a way to the exact place where all of this had started, where the girl who counted bullets had first found out what she was actually made of. Full circle. The months between graduation and deployment filled up with intensive additional training. Advanced urban operations, helicopter insertions, vehicle interdiction. Every scenario the Rangers might throw her into, and she absorbed all of it the way she'd absorbed everything since that first Tuesday evening on the range at Griffin, methodically, obsessively leaving nothing to chance. She deployed in April, landed at Bagram Air Base, and the moment she stepped off the aircraft, the familiar weight hit her all at once, the heat, the dust, the smell of diesel and cordite that meant war. But this time she wasn't there to count the bullets. This time she was there to use them. Her first mission came within a week. An overwatch position during a high-value target raid, 600 meters from the objective, hidden and waiting. Through the scope, she watched Rangers flow through the compound with a precision that reminded her of the SEALs on that rock, and she waited with a patience that had cost her 7 weeks of hell to learn. And then a fighter came up onto a rooftop with an RPG on his shoulder, and she saw him before anyone on the ground could possibly react. And she calculated the range and the wind in the space of a single breath, and fired, and he dropped, and the RPG never launched, and the raid went on without so much as a hitch. Garrett's words came back to her as she watched the Rangers pull out clean. This is your path, guarding men from a position they couldn't see, making the shot they couldn't make, being the guardian angel none of them ever knew was watching over them. And for the first time in her life, she knew with total certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Over the following months, she ran dozens of missions, and every one of them drove the same 3 words deeper into her bones. Patience, precision, purpose. She carried Morse's notebook on every operation, and she began adding her own pages to it, her own observations, her own lessons paid for in the field, the way a river adds to itself downstream. She was building something to pass forward someday, though she didn't yet know to whom. And then in October, an email came in from the Fort Benning personnel office. Master Sergeant Callahan Morse had died. Heart attack in his sleep. October 12th, age 68. No family to notify. She was listed as his emergency contact. She sat on her bunk holding the printed page, and she read it 5 times, and each time the words refused to add up to something real. Morse was gone. The man who had believed in her before she'd given him any reason to. The man who had handed her a rifle and then handed her a future she'd never dared imagine. The man who had looked at her across a tailgate in the fading light and seen the daughter he'd lost. And she was his emergency contact, not the daughter, her. That single fact told her more about the last years of his life than any conversation ever had, and it broke her heart clean in two. She requested emergency leave to attend to his affairs. Denied. Active deployment, mission-critical personnel couldn't be spared. So instead, she wrote him a letter. 10 pages. Everything she'd never said out loud. Everything he'd meant to her, how he'd changed the entire course of her life, how she carried his lessons every single day, how she'd come to think of him as the father of the mines, and the pain had taken from her long before she ever left Montana. And when she was done, she carried the letter out to a burn barrel behind the barracks, and she set it on fire, and she watched the pages curl and blacken and lift up in the heat, and she sent the smoke up to wherever he was and prayed that somehow, some way he could read what she'd written. She kept the notebook. She carried it on every mission after that, and the leather cover grew a little more worn with each deployment, a physical thread connecting her back to the man who'd started all of it. And as long as she had it, some part of her felt like he was still there beside her on the line, telling her to breathe, to be still, to wait. In December, her unit rotation brought her back through FOB Griffin for resupply and rest, and the base had changed. New faces, new buildings, but the memorial wall was still there, and she went to it and she found his name on a fresh brass plaque. Master Sergeant Callahan Morse, 25 years of service. Grenada, Panama, Desert Storm. She stood at attention in front of it and she saluted him, formal and slow and final, and she whispered the words that were only ever meant for him. I made you proud, Sergeant. I'm holding the line, just like you taught me. She left that memorial wall a different woman than the one who'd walked up to it, and she couldn't have told you exactly how only that something had settled in her that hadn't been settled before. The grief didn't leave. It never left. But it stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a weight she'd chosen to carry, which was a thing Morse himself had tried to teach her over the worst coffee in Afghanistan, and now she finally understood it in her bones. She rotated back out to the line, and for the next stretch of her deployment, she was a machine that ran on his lessons. Patience, precision, purpose. She stopped counting her missions the way she'd once counted her kills, because counting them was a road that led nowhere good, and she'd learned that too. She just did the work. She lay in hides for 12, 14, 16 hours at a stretch, and she watched over men who never knew her name. And when the moment came, she made the shot they couldn't make and slipped back into the terrain like she'd never been there at all. But the war had a way of finding the seams in a person, and hers came on a cold morning in February on a mission that started out looking like every other one. It was 0400 when the team inserted. A direct action raid on a compound intelligence swore held a bomb maker responsible for 3 convoy strikes in as many weeks. 12 Rangers on the ground, in Ninsley and Overwatch on a ridgeline 400 meters out, dug into a hide she'd built in the dark, the whole valley laid out below her through the green wash of her night optics. Her spotter that day was a young ranger named Doyle, 22 years old, eager, still new enough to the work that he narrated things under his breath the way rookies do. Movement left of the main structure, Doyle whispered. 2, maybe 3. I see them. She had them in the scope before he finished the sentence. Sentries, rifles slung, not alert, not yet. Hold, they don't know we're here. The Rangers moved up on the compound with that flowing practice silence she'd come to love, and for the first 8 minutes it went exactly the way the briefing said it would. And then at 0411 it stopped going the way anything said it would, because a door on the far side of the compound opened that wasn't supposed to be there, and men started pouring out of it, and there were far, far more of them than the intelligence had promised. Contact, contact. The call came screaming over the radio, and then the whole valley lit up. Muzzle flashes bloomed all across the compound. The Rangers went to ground behind whatever cover they could find, and Ninsley's world narrowed down to the scope and the trigger the way it always did, the way Morse had trained it to. A fighter on a rooftop bringing a machine gun up onto a wall. She put the crosshairs on his chest, breathed, held, and squeezed, and he dropped before the gun ever fired. Good hit, Doyle breathed. 2 o'clock, there's another one. I've got him. She shifted, led him half a body width, fired, down. And for the next several minutes, she was the only reason those men on the ground were still alive, exactly the way Sullivan had been on that rock 2 years before, and she felt the strange doubling of it. The sense that she'd been standing in this exact place before, except this time she was the rifle on the ridge instead of the girl in the dirt. She worked her sector like a metronome. Load, aim, breathe, fire. Every 8 or 10 seconds, another threat gone, and the Rangers began to claw back control of the fight below. Then the radio crackled, and it was the ground force commander, a captain named Reyes, and there was iron in his voice under the strain. Overwatch, we've got a squad trying to flank us east. We can't see them from down here. Can you? She swung the rifle east, and there they were. 6 fighters moving along a wall low and fast, trying to get around the Rangers' flank to a position where they could roll up the whole element. If they reached it, men were going to die. She knew it the way she knew her own name. I see them, Captain, 6 of them. I'm on it. You hold that flank, Grant. You hold it. And she did. She held it. She took the lead man first, then the last man, the way Morse had taught her, so the ones in the middle didn't know which way to run. She fired and worked the bolt and fired again, and the flanking squad broke apart against her fire like a wave against a rock. and the ones who could still move scrambled back the way they'd come and the flank held. It held because she held it. "That's got them," Doyle said, and there was awe in his voice, the same awe she'd once heard in Garrett's. "Ma'am, that was not done yet," she cut him off. "Watch our six. If they came out that door, they know we're up here somewhere." She said it, and 11 seconds later, she was proven right, and it nearly cost them everything. A round cracked past her head, so close she felt the wind of it, and then a second one hammered into the rocks in front of the hide and blew grit into both their faces. Somebody down in that valley had a sniper too, and he'd been doing to her exactly what she'd been doing to them. Patient, watching, waiting for the flashes to give her position away. "Down, get down." She grabbed Doyle by the vest and hauled him flat as a third round tore through the space where his head had been a half second earlier, and she felt the whole terrible symmetry of it close around her like a fist. This was Sullivan's moment playing out again, except now it was her on the wrong end of a patient man's scope, and if she lifted her head to find him, she was dead, and if she didn't find him, he'd walk his fire in until he killed them both anyway. "Where is he?" Doyle's voice had gone tight and high. "I didn't see the flash. I didn't." "Neither did I." She pressed her cheek into the dirt and made herself breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Morse's voice steady in the middle of the chaos. "Panic will get you killed faster than any bullet. Think, where would she be if she were him? High ground, good concealment, a clean line to the ridge." She ran the terrain in her mind, the map she'd memorized before insertion, and there was only one place that fit. A rock shelf on the opposite slope, maybe 550 meters out, with a cluster of scrub that would break up a shooter's outline. "Doyle, when I move, I need you to spot my splash and call the correction. Can you do that?" Yes, ma'am." "You're gonna do fine." She didn't feel as sure as she made herself sound, but that was the job, too, she'd learned. You gave the young ones your calm, even when you had to fake it. "On three, I come up, I take one shot at that rock shelf, and I go back down whether I hit or not. If I miss you, tell me where it went, and we do it again. 1, 2, 3. She came up onto the rifle in one smooth motion, found the rock shelf, and there, half hidden in the scrub, was the barest suggestion of a shape that didn't belong. She didn't have time for a perfect solution. She dialed in what she had. 550, slight left to right wind. She held her breath and squeezed and dropped back into the dirt in the same second, and a round from the enemy, shooter cracked through the air right where she'd been. "Splash low and right," Doyle called. "You were close, low and right, maybe a foot. Low and right." She'd underestimated the drop, and the wind was pushing harder than she'd read. She made the correction in her head, cold and fast, and she didn't let herself feel the fear that was clawing up her throat because Morse had told her 1,000 times that fear was just information, and you either used it or it used you. "Coming up again," she said. "Same drill." She came up. She found the shape. She'd already made the correction, and the crosshairs settled where her mind told her they needed to be, not where her eyes wanted them. And she trusted the math the way she'd learned to trust it in the mud at Benning, and she squeezed. Through the scope in the last half second, before she dropped back down, she saw the shape jerk and go still. "Hit. You got him. You got him." Doyle was practically shaking. "He's down. He's not moving." She lay in the dirt with her heart slamming against her ribs and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 2 years. She just won the exact duel that Sullivan had lost. The enemy sniper had had every advantage. He'd found her first. He'd nearly killed both of them. And she'd beaten him with a borrowed calm from a dead man's voice and a scope ring around her neck that had come off the very rifle she'd picked up the night this whole life of hers began. The fight below broke apart not long after that. With their flanks shattered and their sniper gone, the enemy lost their nerve, and the Rangers pressed their advantage and cleared the compound, and when the gunships came thundering in overhead, it was already over, but for the running. Captain Reyes pulled his men out clean, all 12, not one killed, 3 wounded, and all 3 walking, and that was as close to a miracle as anyone got out there. They exfiltrated to the extraction point, and when Annesley came down off that ridge, stiff and hollow and coated in dirt, Captain Reyes found her before the birds even landed. "You held that flank." He said it like he still couldn't quite believe it. "And then you won a sniper duel from a fixed position after he had you dialed in." "I've been doing this 11 years, Grant. I've never seen anybody do what you did up on that ridge today. Just did the job, sir. No. He shook his head and his eyes were fierce. Don't you do that. Don't you make it small. My men are getting on that helicopter breathing because of what you did. 12 families. You own that. You carry it. You hear me. And she did hear him, and she took it, the whole heavy weight of it, and she didn't try to make it small this time because Morse had taught her that too. You carry the faces you took, but you carry the ones you saved right alongside them, and you put them on the same scale, and you make yourself feel the weight of both. But that night back at Bagram alone on her bunk, the other side of it came for her the way it always did, and this time it came harder than it ever had before. Because she kept seeing the enemy's sniper, not the men she'd taken in the open fight. Those faded the way they always faded into the background noise. It was the sniper, the one on the rock shelf, because she understood him in a way she couldn't understand the others. He'd done exactly what she did. He'd lain patient and still in the cold and waited for his moment. He'd protected his own men from a position they couldn't see. He'd probably learned it the same way she had from some old man who saw something in him, who told him he was capable of more than he knew. He was her on the other side of a valley, and she had put a bullet through him at 550 meters, and now she was going to carry his face too. She pulled out the notebook, and she opened it to a blank page the way she'd started doing after every hard one, and she sat with the pen in her hand for a long time before she could write anything at all. And what she finally wrote wasn't a win table or a range card. It was 2 sentences. He was good. He was somebody's Morse to somebody once. And then she closed the book and she lay back and she let the face come and she carried it because that was the price and she had agreed to pay it a long time ago on a pile of rocks in the dark. The deployment ground on. She had 4 months left when the letter came, and this one changed the shape of everything. It came through official channels forwarded from the personnel office, and it was from an attorney in Georgia handling the estate of Master Sergeant Callahan Morse, deceased. And she almost didn't open it because she thought it would just be paperwork, some form to sign as his emergency contact, some last piece of administrative debris from a life that had already ended. But she opened it, and inside was a second envelope, and on the front of that one, in handwriting that she would have known anywhere, was her name. Her hands went cold. He'd written her a letter before he died and left instructions for it to be sent if anything happened to him. She sat down on the edge of her bunk and she held that envelope for 10 full minutes before she could make herself break the seal, because she knew that once she read it, it would be the last thing he ever said to her, and there would be no more after it, not ever. And some part of her wanted to hold on to the moment before that was true. Then she opened it and she read it in his voice because she couldn't read it any other way. And Inslee, it began. If you're reading this, then I finally ran out of road, and I'm sorry I couldn't say this to your face. There's a couple things I never got to tell you, and I'm too old and too close to the end to be a coward about them anymore. First, I lied to you once, and it's been sitting on me. I told you that you reminded me of my daughter. That's true, but it's not the whole of it. The whole of it is that you didn't remind me of the daughter I lost. You reminded me of the daughter I wish I'd been man enough to raise. Julie was tough, and she was smart, and I loved her more than my own life, and I failed her anyway because I never learned to be present for anybody. You gave me the chance to try again, and you never even knew you were giving it. Every Tuesday and every Thursday out on that range, I wasn't teaching a soldier. I was learning how to be a father. 25 years too late, but I learned it. Because of you. She had to stop reading. She pressed the letter against her chest and shut her eyes and just breathed for a minute because it was too much and there was nobody around to see her do it, so she let herself. Second thing, the letter went on when she could bear to keep reading. I tracked her down, Julie. 6 months before you shipped to Benning, I finally did the thing I'd been too scared to do for years. I called her. Anna Inslee, she picked up. It took 3 tries, but she picked up, and we talked for 2 hours, and by the end of it, she called me Dad. First time in 6 years. I don't know if I'd have ever had the guts to make that call if you hadn't shown up on my range and made me remember what it felt like to have something worth being brave for. You didn't just find your path, kid. You gave me mine back. You gave me my daughter back before I died. There is no way on this earth that I can ever repay that, so I'm not going to try. I'm just going to say thank you, and I'm going to tell you the last thing I've got. You are going to be a teacher someday. I know it the way I knew you'd hit that wall at Benning. When it happens, you're going to look at some scared kid who doesn't believe in themselves, and you're going to see what I saw in you. And when you do, you pour everything you've got into them, and you don't hold a single thing back, and you don't wait until it's too late the way I almost did. That's the whole secret, Ann Inslee. That's the only thing I ever really learned that was worth anything. It was never about the rifle. It was always about the person on the other end of it who needed somebody to believe they were more than they thought they were. Hold the line, kid. Not the one on the ridge. The other one. The one between the people you love and everything that would take them from you. That's the line that actually matters. You've always known how to hold it. You just needed somebody to tell you it was yours to hold. I'm proud of you. I'll be watching. Callahan Morse. She read it 3 times and then she folded it very carefully along the creases he'd made, and she slid it into the back of the notebook behind the inscription he'd written her 2 years before. And she sat there in the dark for a long time and let herself cry the way she hadn't let herself cry since the day the email came. He'd made the call. He'd gotten his daughter back. All that time she'd carried the grief of a man who died with no family. And it turned out she'd been wrong. That in the end he hadn't died estranged and alone. That somewhere in the last year of his life, he'd sat on a phone and heard his own child call him dad again. And he'd told her in his last words that she was the reason. That the scared logistics specialist who almost didn't show up to his range had, without ever meaning to, without ever even knowing, healed the deepest wound in an old man's life. The weight of that settled into her, and it was heavy, but it was the good kind of heavy, the kind you're glad to carry. And she understood for the first time that she'd been given something she could never have earned and could never give back. So she'd do the only thing left. She'd pass it forward, just like he told her to. She had one more mission in that deployment that tested her, and it came 2 weeks before she was due to rotate home, and it nearly broke the promise she just made in her own heart. The team went out to support a village clearing operation, and it was supposed to be routine as anything got out there. But partway through a firefight kicked off near a cluster of buildings where a family was sheltering, and through her scope at 300 meters, Ann Inslee watched a fighter drag a woman out into the open and put a rifle to her head, using her as a shield, screaming at the Rangers to fall back. Overwatch, Captain Reyes's voice came low and urgent. You see this? I see it. Her heart was in her throat. He's got her right up against him. There's no shot. Sir, there's no shot if I miss by an inch. I know what I'm asking. She had him in the scope, and the woman's face filled half her view. Terrified eyes squeezed shut, and behind her, the fighter's head exposed maybe 4 inches above the woman's shoulder. 4 inches at 300 meters with a human life hanging on whether her hands shook. If she took it, and she was wrong, she'd kill an innocent woman with her own hand and carry that face until the day she died. If she didn't take it, the fighter would kill the woman anyway the second the Rangers didn't comply, and she'd carry that instead. There was no version of this where she got to keep her hands clean. Grant, Reyes's voice steady, giving it to her the way a good commander does. It's your shot. I can't make it, and I won't order it. If you don't have it, you don't have it, and no one will ever question you. But if you have it, I need to know now. And she thought about Morse. She thought about the letter in the back of the notebook. She thought about a line between the people you love and everything that would take them from you. And she understood that this woman 300 meters away was somebody's daughter, somebody's mother. Somebody Morse himself would have told her to protect if he'd been lying in the dirt beside her. She breathed. She let half of it out. She held. I have it, she said. The wind was almost nothing. The range was 300 meters a distance she'd shot 10,000 times. The 4 inches of exposed head sat in her crosshairs, and she stopped seeing it as a head stopped, seeing the woman stopped, seeing anything but the mechanics, the way Morse had taught her on the very first night. Don't think about the target as a person, focus on the physics, muscle memory, and practice. And she let everything else in the whole world fall away. Her finger took up the slack, and the shot broke clean. Through the scope, she watched the fighter drop straight down, and the woman stood there for one frozen second and then broke and ran toward the Rangers unharmed, screaming alive. And Ann Inslee lowered the rifle, and her whole body started to shake so hard Doyle had to steady her. You got him, Doyle kept saying. Ma'am, you got him. She's clear, she's clear. She barely heard him. She was already somewhere else, already understanding what she'd just done. that she'd made the shot she'd been more afraid of than any shot in her life, and she'd made it perfect. And the woman was alive because of it, and that face, that terrified, living face, was one she was going to carry too, but this time she was going to be glad to carry it. Captain Reyes came up to her at the extraction point, and he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, and then he said quietly, "In 11 years, I've never asked anybody to make that shot. I'll never forget that you took it." He paused. "That woman's got kids, Grant. 3 of them. They still have a mother tonight because of you." She nodded, and she couldn't speak, and she didn't try to. She just took it, and she carried it, and somewhere in the carrying, she felt the last of the fear she'd lived with since that first night on the rock finally let go of her, because she understood now, all the way down, what the rifle had always been for. It was never about taking. Morse had told her that in his last letter, and now she'd felt it with her own hands. It was about the line. It was about standing between the ones who couldn't protect themselves and the ones who'd hurt them, and holding no matter what it cost, no matter how heavy it got. She rotated home 2 weeks later, and she carried the notebook and the scope ring and the letter, and every face she'd taken and every life she'd saved, and she wasn't the girl who counted bullets anymore, and she was never going to be that girl again. Home didn't feel like home anymore, and that was the first thing nobody warned her about. She'd spent 2 years learning to hold a line in the dark 5,000 miles away, and when she finally stood in her parents' living room in Butte, Montana, with the same gray mountains out the window, and her father in the same chair, in front of the same television, and because standing still hurt too much, she felt like a stranger wearing her own skin. Her mother hugged her so hard it knocked the breath out of her and cried into her shoulder and said over and over how thin she'd gotten. And Ann Inslee held her and said all the right things, and the whole time some part of her was scanning the room out of habit, clocking the exits, reading the angles. And she hated that she couldn't turn it off. Her father didn't get up. He couldn't nod easily, and she knew that, but there was a moment when she came in and he just looked at her from that chair, and something moved across his weathered face that she'd never seen there before. It wasn't the fear she'd expected. It was something closer to awe, and under it, a kind of grief, because he was looking at his daughter and seeing a soldier and understanding for the first time exactly what that meant. "Your brother says you're the scariest person he knows," her father finally said, and his voice cracked on it. "He's not wrong, Dad. I don't—" He stopped. His hands worked in his lap. "I spent my whole life thinking I couldn't give you kids anything. Ruined my back for a paycheck, and I still couldn't send you to college. And then you go off and you do—" He gestured vaguely, helplessly at all of her. "They gave you a Bronze Star in Inslee, with a V on it, for valor, my daughter." And then the tough old copper miner who had never cried a day in her memory put his face in his ruined hands and wept. And she crossed the room and knelt down in front of his chair and held him while he did. "You gave me everything," she said into his shoulder. "You showed me how to not quit when quitting would have been easier. That's the only reason I'm alive. You hear me? Everything I did over there, I did because you taught me how to keep going when your body's screaming at you to stop. That came from you, Dad. That was always yours." And she felt him nod against her, and she felt something between them heal that neither of them had ever known was broken. And she thought of Morse and his letter, and the daughter he'd gotten back on the phone before he died, and she understood that she was living out the exact thing he'd tried to give her. Don't wait until it's too late. She wasn't going to wait. She'd learned that lesson from a dead man's regrets, and she was going to spend the rest of her life refusing to repeat them. She stayed home for 3 weeks, and they were good weeks and hard weeks both. She slept badly. The faces came in the night, all of them, the men in the open, and the sniper on the rock shelf, and the terrified woman she'd saved with 4 inches of margin at 300 meters. But she'd learned how to carry them now, and she didn't fight them. And slowly, night by night, they settled down into the place Morse had told her they'd go. The box you only open when you're strong enough to hold what's inside. Her mother caught her one morning sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open, adding a page in her own careful hand, and she asked what it was. "Something a man gave me," Ann Inslee said. "The best man I ever knew besides Dad. He's gone now. But he left me this, and he left me instructions." She ran her thumb along the worn leather cover. "He told me I'm going to be a teacher someday, and that when it happens, I need to pour everything I've got into whoever comes to me and not hold anything back and not wait until it's too late." Her mother, who'd spent 30 years teaching other people's children in that same great town, looked at her daughter for a long moment. He sounds like he knew something. He knew everything, Inslee said. He just found out too late that it was never about the knowing. It was about the giving. When her leave ended, she got new orders, and when she read them, she had to sit down because the Army, in its blind bureaucratic way, had just handed her the exact thing a dead man had promised she'd receive. Assistant instructor. Basic marksmanship. Training new soldiers back at a support base not far from where her own war had started passing forward, the very knowledge that had been poured into her on a range in the Afghan heat by an old man with scars down both arms. She almost laughed when she read it. Morse had called it a year before it happened, from beyond the grave in a letter she'd carried in the back of his own notebook. You are going to be a teacher someday. I know it, the way I knew you'd hit that wall at Benning. All right, Sergeant, she murmured to the empty room to the man who wasn't there and somehow always was. All right, I'm listening. Her first class was 14 soldiers, and 13 of them were exactly what she expected nervous kids fresh out of training who could barely hold a rifle steady. But the 14th was different, and Inslee knew it the second she walked down the firing line and looked at her. Private Meadow Sutton, 22 years old, a logistics specialist out of Tennessee of all things sent to the range for basic qualification and clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Small, quiet, the kind of soldier who made herself invisible in a crowd who'd learned somewhere along the way that the safest thing to be was unremarkable. And when Inslee looked at her, she felt the ground shift under her own feet because she was looking at a mirror. She was looking at herself. 2 years and a lifetime ago, a supply clerk who counted things and stayed small because staying small was safe. Grant, she said, and then caught herself because she was the instructor now. Sergeant Grant, let's see what you've got, Sutton. She handed the private an M4, the same weapon Morse had first put in her own hands, and Meadow Sutton settled in behind it awkwardly, and she fired 5 rounds downrange. And when Inslee walked out to check the target, her breath caught in her chest. The grouping was tight, fist-sized, every round within a few inches of center. Natural talent visible in the very first string, the same thing Morse had seen in her own target on that first evening at Griffin. Meadow looked up, and there was surprise all over her young face. I didn't know I could do that. And Inslee heard herself say the words before she'd even decided to say them, because they'd been living in her for 2 years waiting. Most people don't know what they're capable of until circumstances demand it. She crouched down beside the private, and she smiled, and she remembered herself 18 months and a whole world ago. You're different, Sutton. You're a natural shooter. That's rare. That means something. It's probably just luck, Sergeant. That's what I said, too. And Inslee's voice was steady and sure. The man who trained me told me it wasn't luck. It took me a long time to believe him. Don't take as long as I did. Over the following weeks, she worked with Meadow the way Morse had worked with her, and she watched the same slow transformation unfold, the same arc she'd lived herself. Uncertainty becoming confidence, fear becoming focus. A logistics specialist who'd spent her whole life being invisible, discovering one clean shot at a time that she'd been carrying something extraordinary inside her the entire time and never known it was there. But Inslee did more than teach her to shoot. She taught her the way Morse had taught, which was to say she taught her about the weight. She sat with Meadow one evening after a session, the way an old man had once sat with her on a tailgate in the fading light, and she told her the truth. There's a thing they don't put in the manuals, she said. If you keep going with this, if this becomes what you do, you're going to take life someday. And it's going to cost you. Every face stays. Nobody tells you that going in, and I'm telling you now because somebody told me, and it saved my life in more ways than one. Meadow's eyes had gone wide. How do you carry it? You don't carry the faces alone. Inslee leaned forward. You carry the ones you save right next to them. Every person who's alive, because you were there, you put them on the scale too. And you talk about it. You don't lock it up inside until it poisons you. The man who trained me lost his whole family because he learned that lesson too late. Her voice went quiet. I'm not going to let you make his mistake. That's a promise. One evening after training, she brought Meadow a small package, and inside was a notebook. New leather cover. And when the private opened it, she found pages already filled in Inslee's hand lessons from Morse's notebook, copied out word for word, alongside lessons Inslee had bought with her own blood. in the field wind tables and range cards, and tucked here and there among the ballistics. Sentences that had nothing to do with shooting and everything to do with staying human while you did it. And on the inside of the cover, an inscription. Patience defeats panic. Everyone holds a line when the moment demands it. You've got this. You've always had this. Meadow read it and her eyes filled and she looked up. Sergeant Grant, I don't, why me? Why are you giving me this? Because 2 years ago, an Inslee said, someone saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. He gave me permission to be more than I thought I was allowed to be. He's gone now. But before he died, he told me that someday I'd meet a scared kid who didn't believe in themselves. And when I did, I was supposed to pour everything I had into them and not hold a single thing back. She put her hand on the notebook. You're that kid, Sutton. I've been waiting for you without even knowing it. So here it is, everything I've got. That's what he'd want. Meadow held the notebook against her chest like it might fly away. What if I'm not ready? Nobody's ready, Inslee said, and she heard Morse's voice under her own, the two of them speaking together across the space between the living and the dead. You just become ready by doing. She stood to go, and then she stopped, and she looked back at the young private one more time. And Sutton, when you get to sniper school, and you will, you remember this, patience defeats panic. Say it back to me. Patience defeats panic, Meadow whispered. That's the whole thing right there, Inslee said. That's the only lesson that ever really mattered. And she left the young woman standing there clutching the notebook with reverent hands, and as she walked away, she felt something she hadn't felt since the day the email came telling her Morse was dead. She felt him with her. Not as a ghost, not as a grief, but as a living thing she was carrying forward into the world, a torch passed from one hand to the next, still burning. That night, she sat alone and watched the sun go down over the same kind of desert where her whole life had cracked open and rebuilt itself. And she thought about the strange, impossible path that had carried her here. A discrepancy in an ammunition log, a tired medic sliding a crumpled paper across a mess hall table, an old man on a range who saw something in a target that she couldn't see herself, a helicopter falling out of the sky, a rifle lying abandoned on the rocks, and 30 feet in one impossible decision standing between her and everyone she was fighting beside. She thought about Sullivan, who'd handed her a scope ring off the very rifle that started it all, and told her to remember that they held the line, all of them. She thought about Garrett, who'd called her family, and meant it, whose team still had their fathers, because a supply clerk hadn't frozen for 1 second longer than she had. She thought about Marcus, who'd been the one to tell her that first day that everyone should know how to defend the people around them, never knowing what he was setting in motion. And she thought about Morse always. Morse, the man who died with his family back in his life because a scared girl had shown up to his range and without ever meaning to taught an old warrior how to be brave enough to make one phone call. She wasn't counting bullets anymore. She'd stopped counting them a long time ago. Now she made every single one count, and more than that, she'd learned there was a kind of shot that had nothing to do with a rifle at all. The kind Morse had made when he pressed his notebook into her hands. The kind she'd made when she handed Meadow Sutton a leather cover with everything she had written inside it. The shot you take when you look at another human being and tell them they are more than they believe they are, and then you spend yourself completely making it true. That was the line Morse had written about in his last letter. Not the one on the ridge. The other one, the one between the people you love and everything that would take them from you. And she understood now that the line didn't end with her and it had never ended with him. It ran backward through every soldier he'd ever trained and every man who trained him all the way back into a history she'd never know. And it ran forward now through Meadow Sutton and through whoever Meadow would someday teach, and on and on. Generation after generation, each one carrying the weight and the wisdom a little further down the road. The legacy didn't stop. That was the whole secret an old man had spent 25 years in one broken family learning. It was never about the rifle. It was never even about the war. It was about the giving passed from teacher to student, hand to hand, one scared kid at a time, each of them holding the line a little longer so the next one could learn to hold it too. She stood and she stretched, and she felt the familiar weight of Morse's notebook in her cargo pocket, and the scope ring on the chain around her neck warm against her skin. She felt the weight of every face she'd taken and every life she'd saved, and she didn't try to set any of it down because she'd finally learned that a person isn't meant to. You carry it, all of it, the taking and the saving both on the same scale, and you let it make you deeper instead of letting it make you hollow. Somewhere out there in the dark, a nervous private from Tennessee was lying awake with a leather notebook clutched to her chest, reading an inscription by the light of a battery lantern, coming to believe for the first time that she might be more than the small, safe, invisible thing the world had always told her she was allowed to be. And Annesley Grant knew that feeling better than she knew her own name, because a man with scars down both arms had given it to her on a range in the heat, and she had carried it through a helicopter crash and a sniper school that broke better soldiers than her, in a duel she should have lost, in a shot she'd been too afraid to take until the moment she took it clean. She had held the line when the moment demanded it. She had held it in the dark on a pile of rocks, with a dead man's voice in her head, and she had held it in the mud at Benning when quitting would have been easier, and she had held it at 300 meters, with a mother's life balanced on 4 inches in a steady hand. And now she would hold it here in the quiet work of building the ones who came after her, which was the hardest holding of all, and the only one that ever truly lasted. The desert wind picked up and carried the sand and the memories with it, and Annesley turned and walked back toward the barracks, toward tomorrow, toward the next scared kid, and the next clean shot, and the next chance to give away everything she'd been given. She was Annesley Grant, former logistics specialist, combat sniper, instructor, guardian, daughter to 2 fathers, one who'd broken his back in the mines and one who'd found her on a range at the end of his life and called her the child he wished he'd raised. She carried them both, and she carried the faces, and she carried the line, and she would never ever set it down.